Hey, everybody. Steve Rode here. We're going to talk about COAs and public aircraft operations today. We're fortunate enough to have Robert, who's here with us from Flight Ventures. Robert is an experienced commercial airplane pilot and also a experienced drone pilot. So Ken says no sound. All right, hold on. Then we got to do this.
Ooh, nice music.
Yeah, well, it gives people who don't have any sound the instructions on how to turn their sound on. So.
Blue skies, feel the wind beneath you as you fly by, dancing on a cloud that lifts you high, high, high. Your troubles blow away.
All right, well, I'm stopping that now that Ken's got his sound problem fixed. Awesome, Ken. All right, so let me give everyone a little bit of an introduction. We have, as I said, we have Robert from Flight Ventures, commercial pilot, also experienced drone pilot. He's going to be talking about this very difficult subject on COA versus public aircraft operations. And this is all the information that you need to know. Everything you've heard out there in the real world, you've heard from other people, you've heard at conferences or seminars. Robert became interested in this topic after we had a conversation some time ago, and then he began doing research. He contributed 4 articles on this subject for the psflight.org website, and I think it's safe to say that his eyes were opened about what reality versus what people were saying is on this topic, and I applaud his dedication to diving deeply into this, and it's a difficult subject. First off, I want to tell you that at the end of this webinar, you will be given a link to take an online test where you will receive a certificate of completion that you can show to the person you least care about, or whatever you want to do with it. It proves that you attended the webinar. And also, if you are a North Carolina public safety staff member employee, you will be able to get continuing education credits for this class. Again, at the end of the webinar, I'm going to be giving you the link. A little bit of housekeeping here on the right side of your screen. You've got a couple of tabs: chat, questions, polls, and the chat tab is where you can go in and type a message that we may all be able to see. But this is how, while Robert's talking, if you have any questions that you want to ask him, things that you want to highlight, you can ask them in the chat tab, and I will raise them as the moderator here. And what other housekeeping? Oh, the other thing is that I'm sure Robert believes my same philosophy, which is I always strive to be right, but reserve the right to be wrong. I encourage you to do your own research, find your own answers for anything that you may have an alternative point of view on. And nobody is the holder of all truth, but this is the best research that we could put together. Robert, does that about cover it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the agenda over to Robert here. You're going to see my smiling face sitting here listening to the same webinar, and Robert's asked me to stay tuned to pitch in if I have anything also to offer. But I hand the baton to you.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I welcome all the viewers here too to this webinar. And as you indicated, I'm not the purveyor of all truth or all wisdom. Wish I was, but haven't figured out a way to do that yet. And I do reserve the right to be wrong. Basically, what I'm going to do here is present this information in terms of research that I've done in combination with contact with different organizations, specifically with the FAA. Matter of fact, I actually developed a Bible putting all my notes here such that it's really difficult to remember all this information. So I usually use it as a repository to kind of look up different information, etc. I can't tell you how many hours I put into trying to distill this very confusing and complicated subject into something that I hope the audience will find valuable in pursuing the right decision as to moving forward. So in terms of the agenda, I want to talk about the options that you have. You probably already know what they are, either Part 107 or the PAO COA route. I'm going to talk a little bit about the upside and downsides, option comparisons, the process, potential disqualifiers, the fines that can be levied by the FAA, and then some final thoughts, and then we can open up for Q&A. And I hope to keep my formal part down to about 30 minutes so we can allow plenty of time for interaction. And I'm sure if you have any questions, you can raise them in the chat bar to the right. In terms of a governmental entity or a safety agency, you really have two options. One is a civil operator, that's the Part 107, or public aircraft PAO via COA process. In terms of the public aircraft operator, the upsides that I see are you can do nighttime operations, forget the daylight waiver, because as Steve had previously, there is no such thing as a daylight waiver. It's really flying at night or not. And one confusing area in talking with PAOs is that when they feel that we can fly over people, the answer is no, you cannot. It is only momentary flight over people, not a carte blanche pass to fly over people. And when it comes to the definition of momentary, it's not what you and I consider momentary. That definition is going to be defined by the FAA as what they determine as momentary. And as I'm sure you get right now, definitions here are not going to be what we define. And we'll talk a little bit about that in some future slides here. In terms of the downside, the oversight shifts to a governmental entity or safety agency. That's going to be your organization, not the FAA. In terms of liability and legal exposures, they may exceed the self-insuring abilities of your organization. And in terms of flying, you are responsible as a PAO to file NOTAMs and guess what? Monthly reporting requirements. If that doesn't harken back to the 333 exemption days, hopefully you'll know where that comes from. So you are required to submit monthly reporting requirements, including if you'd have done nothing in that month. Isn't that a treat? In terms of some of the comparisons, I wanted to kind of compare and contrast the Part 107 and the PAO. As a pilot, under 107, there are certificates, your RPIC. Under a PAO, you can self-certify, which means responsibility for the quality of the pilot and their operation is totally up to you. In terms of the aircraft, under 107, we are limited to plus 55.55 pounds or under 55 pounds. In your case, can be whatever you certify. In terms of airspace, we can pretty much fly carte blanche Class G. In order to get into Class airspace, we have to apply for a certificate of authorization. In your case, you're ruled by the statute. And that's basically Title 49, 401-202A, and 41, which is 401-25. And the point I want to make a recommendation here is that as you set up your PAO operation, please read through those statutes. I know they include a lot more in there than applies to us. That includes National Guard, Army, military operations, etc. But it is a very good repository to find out what you need to be a legal PAO. And it's a very complete, well, and can be confusing document as well. In terms of operations, again, under 107, we follow the FAA regs. As a PAO, it's again, the statutes. In terms of oversight, under Part 107, we do have FAA oversight. Under PAO COA, there is no oversight authority. But the key here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that FAA regulations still apply. And I'll chat about that a little bit more later. In terms of violations, you and I both either Part 107 or if we bust the rules under PAO, we are subject to civil penalties. And I'll have some examples of that again a little bit later. In terms of insurance, usually Part 107 coverage is available. Under PAO, there may not be. Matter of fact, if you check with AOPA, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, they will not cover part PAO operators. And a lot of times PAO pilots think that they're going to be covered by the governmental entity or the safety agency's insurance policy. I would suggest that before you take on any PAO flight, make sure that the insurance coverage under your organization either does not have the aviation exclusion or you are covered. Otherwise, you as a pilot will be personally liable, and that could get very expensive and very nasty in a hurry. In terms of the PAO process, here's the recommendation that I give my clients advice to follow. 1, study the statutes, as I've indicated previously. 2, develop a use case and what can be approved. Now, what I mean by that is that what is this going to be used for to make sure you don't run afoul of commercial and what I call civil operations? And you need to make sure that you know what can be approved. Otherwise, you're going to fall back into a civil operating procedure. You need to file a public declaration letter. And there are a number of requirements that you need to go through to do that. It has to be on the entity letterhead. It typically has to be developed by either the city, county, state attorney general, in other words, somebody in a legal capacity to prove that this entity is indeed a governmental entity. And there's obviously some more requirements as well, but it has to be done by someone in a, let's say, a legal capacity. It cannot be done by a city administrator or a commissioner or anything like that. They want to make sure it's legit. You then need to register your aircraft following the CAPS process, as you see here. You complete the certificate of authorization. And I think the final thing that if you get nothing out of what I present today is realize you're establishing or adding to your current flight department. And a couple things can happen. This is what I call the 4 A's: airspace, airmen, aircraft, and administration. You really are setting up a flight department. And in some cases, you may be working with maybe an existing flight department in terms of medevac, helicopters, manned aircraft aviation. In many cases, in talking with chief pilots, they really want to keep the drone part of their flight department separate from their manned aircraft department. There was an interesting case that happened. It was with an organization where the VP of finance and the chief pilot were not really conversing with one another. And the chief pilot had a pristine record with manned aircraft. They had basically put a drone operation in place, somewhat unbeknownst to the chief pilot. The VP of finance says, hey, no big deal. What I'm going to do is add the insurance waiver as a rider to our existing manned aircraft policy. And lo and behold, about 6 months later, the chief pilot was tagged with a bill that was about 3 to 4 times what they normally paid. And he couldn't figure out what was going on. And what had happened, there was an incident with a drone that got tagged against the flight department, and the insurance company decided to uprate all the manned aircraft operations because of that. Unbeknownst, and again, the VP of finance said, hey, no big deal. The chief pilot says, hey, what's going on? So what I recommend is that if you decide to set up a drone operation, do keep it separate from any manned operations, such that anything that gets gigged or violations, whatever, applies strictly to the UAVs and not the manned aircraft, to save you, in this case, thousands of dollars in insurance premium with manned aircraft operations. In terms of criteria, what I want to go through here as far as self-certification, and I know this might be a little hard to read, but I wanted to give you some ammunition on how to set up your flight department. In terms of pilot, some of the things you may want to consider are, what are the prerequisites? Is there particularly a knowledge coming, a base that they have to come from? In other words, have they taken manned aircraft flight training? Have they taken UAV flight training? You know, what is their pedigree? What is their background? Are you going to have recurrent flight tests, reviews? Do you have currency standards? Minimum hours? Is there a medical issue that you have to address as well? And there's perhaps more, but at least get you started in the right direction. And you can kind of get the sense of where I'm trying to guide you, is that it's kind of like in an interview with a bank robber. You said, hey, this is a great occupation until you get caught. And the point is that with the FAA, if they come out and do a ramp check on you, they're going to look to you to have documentation as good, if not better, than what they're normally used to. And this could be with the Part 119, which I believe is air carriers, or Part 105, 135, which is charter operations. Because you're a PAO, there's not going to be any forgiveness or leeway. They want to see as good, if not better, than what they're currently used to. So if we continue on, if we look at aircraft, again, you can self-certify. What are your positions in terms of airworthiness? You know, operation manuals, updates, repair, maintenance logbooks, you know, add-ons, which could be different type of sensors, weight and balance, performance criteria, and the list goes on. In terms of airspace, again, self-certify. This one is really, really difficult because maintaining a governmental mission is determined on a flight-by-flight basis. And again, the definition that's used here is not going to be the definition you, I, or Steve apply to it. It's going to be the FAA to determine if it's a qualified mission. Blanket airspace means you're covering a specific area. Jurisdictional means it's specific to a particular operation. In terms of operations, you obviously, we talked about the statutes before. This is something that you need to become familiar with. And obviously, what are your issues or minimums in terms of weather, aircrew? Are you going to have a visual operator, you know, a visual observer or not? Environmental, is there particular areas that you will not fly because of instructions, or perhaps because of turbulence, or because near airports, whatever. Communication standards, you know, what are you going to use for communications? Is it going to be two-way, you know, full duplex radios? Is it going to be cell phones, etc.? What are your minimums, night ops, exceptions, you know, and again, the list goes on. In terms of FAA oversight, you know, limited to none. But I want to impress on you that as a governmental entity, you are responsible for the oversight. And as a PAO, you and the PIC, you can be held personally liable for an infraction. And typically where that infraction comes into play is when the qualified mission no longer becomes a qualified mission. And when you're, let's say, not a qualified mission, guess what? You fall back on civil flight rules and regulations, which again is Part 107. In terms of violations, both of us get nailed with civil penalties, and I'll kind of show you some of the charges that can be levied against you and I if we bust kind of the qualified mission rules. And in terms of flight status, again, this is really the kicker. It's on a flight-by-flight basis. So you could unknowingly be conducting civil operations when you think you're flying a qualified mission. It's very scary. In terms of potential disqualifiers, basically what we're seeing here is that you must own your equipment outright or have an exclusive lease for at least 90 contiguous days and be a subdivision of a state, District of Columbia, or a U.S. territory. Those are part of the rules you need to follow. In terms of qualified missions, again, this is really kind of the Pandora's box, the trap door, is determined on a flight-by-flight basis. And then finally, what are the governmental functions? Could be national defense, could be intelligence, firefighting and search and rescue, which I know many of you are very familiar with, perhaps law enforcement, some little more that are arcane or aeronautical research, biological or geological resource management. Now, again, these are definitions that are developed by the FAA, not by you or me. So if I go out and I get ramp checked by an FAA inspector, which means somebody from the FAA comes out and tries to find out, hey, what are all my flight escapades going on here with the drone I'm flying? And I say, oh, I'm flying for national defense. They come up and say, well, our definition of national defense is this. I don't think you're flying for national defense. Therefore, you're no longer working under the PAO rules and regulations self-certification, you're now classified as a civil operator. Therefore, let me see your Part 107 license, and let me see your flight book, your logs, your maintenance manuals, operations, etc. So remember, these definitions are from the FAA, not how you and I define them. In terms of fines, here are some civil penalties that can be levied against you and me and the entities. In terms of, I mean, they really get kind of crazy. And it's really sad in a way, because what we're trying to do is promote the use of this operation, but the FAA takes, well, let's just say take a conservative view of this, and they want to make sure that they maintain control of the airspace. So they want to make sure it's financially unpalatable for you and I to violate these kinds of rules. And therefore they make it very expensive when we do so. But at least this will give you an idea of what you're kind of up against if we kind of break the PAO self-certification operations. Some of my final thoughts. The FAA and the NTSB considers drone operators to be real pilots. And those of us who have had the great fortune of becoming manned aircraft pilots know full well that our flight instructors really pounded into our brains PIC, pilot in command. And what that means is that we as RPICs or PICs are 100%, no questions asked, the buck stops here, liable and responsible for the flight. So if the incident commander comes up to you and says, hey, Robert, I need you to fly this, and I say, I'm sorry, Steve, I can't because of these restrictions or these rules, or it's unsafe, etc., and I allow Steve to override that, I'm on the hook for the violations, not Steve and not anybody else. So just remember that the FAA, NTSB, is going to treat you just like you're a 747 captain or flying a Cessna 182. It doesn't matter. The buck stops with you. In terms of the Part 191 rules, all but a few still apply to us PAO pilots. There seems to be some kind of misnomer out there that, gee, we go POA and therefore we don't have to worry about FAA rules and regs. The answer is absolutely not true. If you bust any of these rules, especially like we talked about, the ultimate responsibility, and they have the 9113, which kind of the FAA's catch-all, that's where they put careless and reckless. They figure, well, if I can't fit you into any one category, I certainly can cite you for careless and reckless because you're flying over people. And it's not just momentary. It looks like you're doing it a long time. Oh, you're flying close to power lines. That's dangerous. Careless and reckless. You're flying in bad weather, exceeds the capabilities of the aircraft. This is kind of their catch-all, to say you are no longer operating safe, and therefore we're going to nail you. In terms of nonprofits, these are 501c3s. Many volunteer fire departments and rescue squads don't meet the PAO subdivision of a state, DC, or US territory. So for those of you that are flying, volunteer fire departments, please check into your rules and regs, because you can become a governmental entity, but there may be some gymnastics your legal counsel has to lead you through to get there. But just make sure you're covered, because if you're not, even though you think you're a PAO, you're not. You're basically flying civil Part 107, and you know what the fines can be. In terms of PAO requires, if you're actually looking at flying PAO, it's possible you may have to set up 2 sets of records for everything, because what happens if you need to fly a Part 107 mission? Now, some of it, because they don't want to have you mixing Part PAO and Part 107 documentation. They want to see separate operations. So this is sometimes where operators will choose to go the Part 107 route as opposed to the PAO, just to keep the administration nightmare down to a dull roar. In terms of other final thoughts, realize that you're establishing or adding to a flight department like we talked about before. Part 119 is air carriers, 135 is charter. In terms of self-certification, please take this to heart. Self-certification does not mean no certification. It truly means an equivalent or better than FAA certification standards. So if you get inspected or ramp checked, that's what the FAA is going to expect. In terms of oversight responsibility, it shifts from the FAA to the entity or agency, and the FAA regulations and potential surveillance still remain in full force and effect. So just because you're a PAO doesn't mean you're off the FAA, no pun intended, radar screen. You're there. And in terms of the benefits, this is really something I think maybe your comptroller, accountant, whatever financial person, take a look at the benefits operating under PAO COA to find out if the potential risks and liability are worth the cost of not being Part 107 compliant. In some cases, you'll find that indeed under Part 107, there are some insurances, some liabilities, and that kind of thing that play to your benefit that are not available under PAO. But again, that's something you may want to take up with some of the people that are responsible for setting up this particular operation. How did I do as far as time here, Steve? I wanted to keep it down to about 30 minutes. I wasn't. Yeah,
there you go. Well, I think
not bad.
We went through a lot of material, and we do have a question here. So Luis says, I'm flying for a rural nonprofit fire department.
I think I lost your sound, Steve, so go ahead.
Okay. Under 107, this is what I recommended to the chief was the correct path versus a CAO. Was I right? So the answer, Luis, is you are absolutely right. The problem is, as we watch Robert solve his sound issue, the problem is that in states like, for example, in North Carolina, the department that I fly for is a paid and volunteer department. It is a nonprofit agency, as are most fire departments in North Carolina, and we are not able to get approved as a governmental entity for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with pension plans. And, if we approve you as a governmental agency, then you become eligible for the state pension plan, a whole bunch of other things. And so, in fact, sending the letters to state representatives and the Attorney General's office wound up here in North Carolina with no response at all. And they didn't want to do that. So, personally, Robert, can you hear me yet?
Nope.
Not yet. So personally, I think that the risk of going the COA route is so high, and the requirement that you self-certify is such a liability that it makes no sense, in my opinion, to go the COA route. Everybody ends up on the hook. It's much better for you to go the Part 107 route. Okay, you can't self-certify. You have to take a test. But I've actually had people tell me the reason we went the COA route was because our pilots would never pass the test. And that is not a good reason to do that. So I think hands down, even if you're flying under a COA, you're flying public aircraft operations, have the backup to pull out your Part 107 when your flight doesn't meet the requirement. And for example, as Robert said, not every flight meets the public aircraft operation requirement. And let's say that you're doing a training flight or you're doing a demonstration flight as part of your agency. That is not covered under aircraft operation. So
I think I can hear you, Steve. Whoa.
Move your microphone away.
See if I can
Further away from your speaker. All right. So things like a demonstration flight or a training flight, under the definition of a public aircraft operation, don't comply. And so unless you have a Part 107, you are flying without any sort of protection at all. So Robert, I went through a whole bunch of stuff there while you were fiddling with your sound. You can hear me now? Okay, he cannot hear me now. I think we have another question here. So, is the COA through the FSDO? Asked Sean. The COA is you file that through the FAA. There's an online portal that you do now, but mentioning the FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, is a great point of contact. The problem, though, is that not every FSDO is created equal, and some are aware of drone regulations, some are totally not aware, some are just the worst customer service you've ever had, some don't return your calls. If you have a question that you want to present to a FSDO, the FAA office responsible for your area, you can call another FSDO not in your area to try to find an answer. If you call 10 FSDOs, you'll get 8 different answers. So don't rely just on what one person might say. If they can, ask them to put it in writing or point you to an FAA online document that you can then rest on. So John says, what is the average time frame to receive your COA? I've seen time ranges all over. Some people get it right off the bat, and some people it requires some fine tuning. Let's see if somebody disagrees with me, but I would say be prepared for up to 6 months. And in the meantime, make sure you're flying under Part 107. Make sure all your pilots are Part 107 before you file for your COA. All right, so let me, before I forget, I am going to send this link to you for, Robert says, usually 45 to 90 days. I'm going to send this link to you in the chat tab. This is the link for the continuing education credits. And I think we've covered just a lot of the information. One of the things that Robert has expressed going through this process is how difficult it is to get a straight answer, because even the vagueness of the regulations that the FAA has to deal with seems to some people like it gives you a lot of latitude. However, understanding that the FAA is a very conservative organization historically, that they will interpret it in the strictest way. If you go to the FAA website, FAA.gov, you can search for legal opinions that were already given, and you can download those legal opinion letters. But I think the one document that is, and let me send you the link to this. I got to look it up. It's on the website, psflight.org, under a COA article. Well, Kurt, you asked for the link to the web posted webinar. It'll be the same link that you logged in at, and you can view the replay there and get the information. Okay, but I want to send you the link to this particular document. Okay, 2 things. This is the article that contains a ton of links and resources for you, but I've got to find the link to this Alaska situation. ALASKA. Okay, so the Alaska State Troopers fly a number of aircraft, and you would think that anybody who could get public aircraft operations correct, they have a professional flight department, pilots that only do this sort of thing, but they had an accident, and the NTSB determined that they were not even operating in a compliant way. And if the Alaska State Police with state troopers with, I don't know, 50 aircraft run afoul, then people who are just getting into aviation are more likely than not to run afoul of the regulations. Okay, so here is the link to take the online test. It's the one that I just posted. It's the link above that is the NTSB report about the Alaska State accident. This is probably the most key sentence in this NTSB, that even though they were flying public aircraft operations for years, they found that their operation didn't have the necessary structure to qualify them as a safe operation. All right. Well, let me ask Robert, since you can hear me, apparently, still, is there anything that you want to add that I haven't covered here? Kurt, there is no deadline for taking the exam. All right, guys. Well, hopefully next time we do this, we'll solve all of our audio and technical problems. But for now, you can go back at any time since you registered, and you can replay the video. The webinar folks, software folks might have changed the download link. That's the way it used to be. Surprise, it's like flying a DJI aircraft. Every time you log on, there's a new software surprise. But until then, you know how to reach me. Oh, here's Robert's email address. Let me post this. There you go. That's Robert's email address. Feel free to reach out and email him directly if you have any additional questions. And this is my email address. Have a great day.